So just to emphasize here this relationship between regime type and state strength, none of the evidence that I just talked about really debunks modernization theory, since modernization theory is really about long-term trends. And what we just talked about are sort of relatively short-term growth patterns. Modernization isn't just a potentially useful determinant of democratic breakthrough, but also of democratic survivability. And that's important. Because what we find is that wealthy democracies tend to be those strong, those resilient ones. Poorer ones, though, those that are less developed, less modernized, tend to be much more frail. And especially when they face economic crisis, they can quickly collapse within a year or so of the crisis. So empirically, we've got a short duration of many democracies, and this tends to be about poor ones rather than wealthy ones. Those that came into being after World War II, and those that had a higher degree of poverty. The rapid development can also change the class structure, urbanization, etc., which we talked about, and create strains in authoritarian rule as well. And so this is where you have something between wealth and poverty in the non-democratic survival case, and that's where you have the upheavals that are likely. Wealthy non-democracies tend to be much more resilient. Impoverished non-democracies tend to be quite resilient. It's this middle ground right here where you have the change in class structures that you have this change, potential change in regime. So going back to democracy and how it's supposed to work, given what we know about state evolution and various regime types, well, what do we mean by democratization? There are three interrelated goals of democratization. The first is to check arbitrary rulers, to hold them accountable, and to make them representative to some degree of the population. The second is to replace them with just and rational ones. And then the third point here is to give the population a say in rulemaking. And all of these are about representation and accountability at the end of the day. But democratization is not cut and dry. It's not just a revolution and bam, you've got democracy. Rather, it's a process of institutionalization or democratic consolidation. What we mean by democratic consolidation is bringing into place the various ingredients so that democratic patterns are, quote, habitually known, practiced, and accepted by most, if not all, actors. In other words, democracy is a consolidated democracy if everybody agrees to play by the rules of the game, the formal rules of the game that have been laid out. Democracy has often been defined along Dahl's notion of procedural minimum. And so this procedural minimum includes seven key ingredients, and then Schmitter and Carl add a couple more, so we've got a total of 9. The first one is that government decisions are made by elected officials. The second is that those elected officials are actually chosen in frequent and fairly conducted elections. In other words, there's no coercion used to place people into office. Third, practically all adults have the right to vote in the election of officials. Note, not all adults. It depends a bit on the democracy. In some democracies, for example, people who are in jail can vote, and others they cannot. Practically all adults have the right to run for elective offices in government as well. Again, go back to this. And also citizenship regulations often vary. Sometimes age limits in the United States, for example, there are age minimums. The fifth point here is free expression for citizens. In other words, you can express your opinion, and there's no danger you're going to be punished for it. The sixth point is a free press. Citizens have a right to alternative sources of information. These sources of information are protected by the law, and so the leaders who are in power can't go up to a newspaper they don't like it and close it down, for example. And the seventh point here is freedom of association. The right to form independent associations or organizations. These are the very civil society groups that we keep referring to. Interest groups, political parties as well. Schmitter and Carl add 2 more to the heap here. The eighth is that popularly elected officials can govern without overriding opposition from unelected officials. And this can be formal opposition or informal opposition. Often this refers to really the military in many cases, where the military steps in and overrides elected officials in many countries. And the ninth point here is that the polity is self-governing. In other words, we've got sovereignty. Not autonomy. Remember, there's a difference between autonomy and sovereignty. Sovereignty refers to self-governing without being forced by external actors to go one way or another with respect to policy decisions. So, for example, Kosovo, Iraq, Afghanistan can't be democracies with foreign troops and foreign political powers on the ground. So we can't even call them democracies. Of course, there are lots of other reasons why we wouldn't call them democracies yet either, as of 2014. But this is one sort of element that Schmitter and Carl throw out there. So if you look at this minimum, really it focuses on this sort of what we call electoralism, the notion that regular, free, and fair elections are really enough to classify you as a democracy. And over the last decade or so, there's been a move much further past electoralism. It's not just about ultimate accountability, which is what electoralism is, right? It's about being able to vote the rascals out at the end of the day. But it's also about influencing the system in the meantime. And this is why Schmitter and Carl, well, I'm sorry. This is why the notion of interest groups is especially important here in social movements. We need people speaking to one another in other words, create horizontal ties between citizens. We need information flows. We need pressure points where citizens can press on their elected officials, not just during the electoral cycle, but at any point, and put in their input and make demands. And this often involves barometers of public opinion, which in a democracy are frequently adhered to. Elected officials hear what public opinion is saying, and if there's a very strong movement in public opinion, they tend to move that direction as well. So note that democracies have different degrees of consensus and participation, access, responsiveness, majority rule, parliamentary sovereignty. All these things differ depending on the democracy. Pluralism, federalism, presidentialism, checks and balances. All these different institutional types can vary depending on the type of democracy and the sort of, what's the best word for this? The sort of pattern, I guess, of democracy that people decide, or template of democracy that people decide to put into place. And we'll talk about this later in this class, how these various institutions come together and create different types of democracies that really affect the state in different ways. So there are several inherent problems of democracy. And one of the reasons you have these various institutions that I just mentioned is because people try to get around some of these problems. But democracy itself poses problems for the process of democratization and democratic consolidation. So we can look at four elements of democracy that complicate democratization. The first is competition, and then you've got a question of representation versus governability, populism, and majoritarianism. So we'll start with the first, competition. There's a constant competition is something that you need in a democracy, right? You want to have alternatives. We want to be able to vote for someone else, for example. But constant competition means constant conflict. And there's the risk that conflict in the short term could become unrestrained and could turn violent and anti-democratic. And this is a real risk in democratizing states. Numerous cleavages and a lack of democratic norms in a given society, which is very typical in non-democracies, make it much harder to moderate these sorts of conflicts. So competition, as great as it is for a mature democracy, can be very problematic for a newly democratizing state. The second point here, representation versus governability. There's this constant tension because you need the ability to act. You don't want to just sit with parliamentary deadlock, with governmental deadlock. You need to act to respond to various demands. You need to represent, yet have enough autonomy to rise above pressures. So there's this tension between actually being able to exercise authority, in other words, govern, and represent the people who have various opinions. And this isn't just about political parties in parliament. It's the same with the judiciary. It's the same with the bureaucracy. If any of them are held too closely by one group, then it's hard to come up with workable policies, and it could lead to a weak state and a crisis of confidence. In other words, people are going to oppose the policies that come about. So this representation versus governance issue is very important, especially when it comes back to questions of legitimacy and actually implementation of policy. So all these things are sort of bound together. The third point here is populism. Doing what's popular is not always the best or the preferred program for the long term. Right? Planning long term is really hard when you're thinking about the next electoral cycle, as you are in a democracy. And this can lead to radicalism and unsound policies. So the risk of populism is ever present in a democratizing state, especially before there are strong, coherent, and cohesive party platforms that people recognize. In other words, the Green Party represents this, the Red Party, Orange Party and yellow parties represent this, that, and the other. Um, the possibility of radicalism and populism is sort of an ever-present danger in democratizing states. And the fourth element here is majoritarianism. A majority has primacy and can run the country as it wishes, even trampling the rights of the minority. And obviously, this can lead to instability, especially in countries with significant minority populations. Otherwise, it can lead to other human rights violations that don't bring about instability, but make democracy not necessarily more favorable for elements of the population than non-democracy. So, I guess the sort of last question here is, can you think of ways around these things? And I might save that for a discussion question. So we'll stop there.